Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making the Rounds. I am here with Emily, and she is in LA, so if you hear a distant sound in the background, it's because she has a fan on in winter. That is Los Angeles for you. In any case, we are
Weird.
back talking about more stuff that sort of became hot topics within the community over the course of Worlds and then a little bit of the time after Worlds, and some of the stuff about like misapplications of sports to esports. Today, we're going to talk about Moneyball. Obviously, I brought this up in a couple of situations. It came up a couple of times on Narrative Wake. I've ranted about it on Twitter. She's probably ranted about it on Twitter. So we're just going to make something specifically looking at the use of statistics in esports and this concept of Moneyball in general, and this idea that because baseball revolutionized scouting or something of that nature, that it can happen in League of Legends as well, very easily. So first, I want to have Emily do an introduction to Moneyball, which is something that she's looked at and studied a little bit, and has otherwise been kind of inflated and looked at as some sort of romantic, exciting thing that you see in pop culture, or there's been movies, there's been books. We're not really sure what it is. It's become a verb, apparently. Anyway, Emily, please give
It
us an
has.
introduction.
The verb usage of Moneyball, like I'm gonna Moneyball this, is very entertaining to me. Anyway, so what Moneyball actually is it's a nickname based on a book that was written on in sabermetric approach to looking at players and scouting players. And what sabermetrics are is it's named after the Society for American Baseball Research, and it's a series of empirical statistics that you look at when you are trying to evaluate a player or a team. So that's actually where it comes from. Moneyball is the book, which is on the Oakland Athletics, which I'm not going to get into. If you're interested in baseball, I suggest you read it because it's interesting. But yeah, so that is what it's about. It focuses on being able to take a almost completely statistical approach to looking at how you're going to use players and build a team. That's it. That is actually it. It's a very short explanation for something that's kind of really blown up in pop culture.
And my understanding was that it came about because some baseball team wanted a better statistical approach to find kind of undiscovered baseball player gems where they could really have strong talent that gets overlooked for maybe not being on the top team, and they wanted to use statistics that specifically pinpoint that kind of player that haven't necessarily been used. So
yeah, it basically operates under the assumption that like everything is hopefully I explained this correctly. That like you scouting and management and all these things have been in baseball for a really long time in terms of looking at players and scouting players. Those are all flawed due to inherent biases and how people talk to each other about players and how people evaluate players using the eye test. And it takes like it says like some of these statistics are kind of irrelevant in evaluating players, and so it takes other more advanced statistics to try to look at players from a more objective perspective and try to scout players that maybe people haven't noticed yet.
right, so they ended up using statistics that people weren't really looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Probably shouldn't go into deep detail of this because it's been a while since I researched this, but it was just basically looking at overlooked statistics, in particular statistics that were already in publication about baseball. People were already collecting these information, but they weren't really used to gauge players, and statistics like batting average and stuff like this were being used much more and had a lot of flaws and weren't actually helpful. It was like using KDA.
Yeah. It's basically like you're looking at slugging percentage and on-base percentage instead of a raw batting average,
right,
if you want to boil it down to like a specific statistical group, I guess.
I think in general, then, like, what we want to talk about when we get into this is why we feel like it's hard to find something like that in League of Legends, or why that people who constantly bring up Moneyball it doesn't necessarily apply to esports and League of Legends in particular, and some of the factors and barriers of entry for this kind of approach to exist in League of Legends that don't exist in baseball. So, first, I guess, what is your idea on the existing statistics that exist that are in League of Legends? Like, do you think that there are any existing statistics in League of Legends that people overlook and could be very valuable for scouting players?
I mean, I think the main issue with statistics right now in League of Legends is that the vast majority of them, outside of a few exceptions, are like counting or just things that are a summation of what happens, right? So like that's like KDA is the best example because it's the easiest statistic, and even if you're a random solo queue player, you know how to calculate that, right? And what I mean by counting statistics is that there's no other analysis put in other than your kills, your deaths, your assists, and that's it. And you come up with the ratio that way. And so it doesn't really tell you a lot, actually. It doesn't tell you really much at all. And with the few, so like a while ago, I tried to see if there would be an ability to calculate a war for a position in League of Legends, and I quickly learned that there are, and war is wins above replacement, by the way, which is a baseball metric, or statistic. I quickly learned that there are so many variables in League of Legends that maybe it's possible, but it's certainly not possible for me to do because I'm too stupid. And there's just like so much that you would have to keep track of. When you're taking something like baseball, it's a simple game and it's had years upon years upon years to marinate and for people to look at it, and more recently be able to run certain things through different computers and come out with these more advanced statistics. For League of Legends, it's new. There are so many other variables. Like even if you're just taking one position, so like you wouldn't even be able to do a war for an entire, like all the players. You'd have to do it for position by position already. And then breaking that down even further, there's like champion choice, spell choice, like runes and masteries. How like there's just it balloons, like the variables just balloon everything exponentially, which makes it makes advanced statistics in League of Legends really, really difficult to calculate. So right now, in my opinion, there aren't many statistics that you could look at, or there aren't any statistics, I should say definitively. There are no statistics you can take without looking at how that player plays in the game itself. And that's not saying statistics are useless. It's saying there is no way to do, in my opinion, an empirical analysis of a player without watching them in-game.
And I think to kind of tease out some of the points that you made already, even just talking about the position analysis, right? There are positions in baseball, right? There's like pitchers and people who specialize in that, but you have specific statistics and things that you're looking for every time that particular player plays a game, right? That are specific to that role. Even in League of Legends, for every position, the character or the champion that you're playing is going to change in almost every game. So the expectations of what that particular player in that particular role have already changed from game to game. So maybe if you're a mid laner who is doing playing a mage one game, your expectation is just to do a ridiculous amount of damage or to clear necessarily. I mean, even within the subsection of mage, that changes a lot. But like if you're playing Lulu mid, for example, then your expectation as Lulu mid is going to be drastically different from your expectation as Cassiopeia. And I think from that position, and mid is a position where it's not like doesn't diverge as much as say top lane or even support or anything of that nature. I think they're just, and jungle, like there are a ridiculous amount of variance in almost every single position. Probably AD carry is the most consistent in terms of like what you expect from an AD carry, but even then there's a lot of variables, like there are engage based AD carries, there's all sorts of stuff that is not consistent throughout what you expect from AD carry and how your team composition is built up. So you aren't going to find like a consistent statistic across every champion or in every game what the expectation of that player is in that game. Then, like you said, it goes on even when they're all playing, you find multiple games where they're playing the same champion. You have variables changing like builds, the champions that he's playing against or with. You have other statistics, other factors in play, like patch changes, because you might be able to get, like you're not going to be able to get the raw number of games of Deft playing Ezreal before Ezreal gets nerfed, right? Or Ezreal gets changed in some way. So then you have to take that into consideration. And you have to either make an adjustment to your data or start over with the Ezreal data, and then you don't get a broad enough sample size in that case anyway. So even if you're getting to a point where you've played enough games with these specific circumstances, which you probably never will anyway because of how many different factors and how different circumstances change even when you're on the same champion and everything else, even when everyone is on the same champion, even if you could somehow get to a point where you have enough data like that, the game changes. So probably the next time you can't get enough data in that regard either. There's just like so many variables in play that it's really difficult to look across all of their games and synthesize all of this, account for all of these differences in a meaningful way, that you can get an accurate representation with any statistic in any regard of this player's performance. Like, for example, let's say you're looking at a statistic like jungle proximity, and you have a major patch change, like you have Riot constantly tweaking how much they want catch-up experience to count. Yeah. So I would say that right now, or that last year, it mattered that, first of all, like even within jungle proximity, you're not necessarily knowing what is happening. You just know that this jungler is close to the mid laner or whatever, the champion, for a high period of time. So the mid laner could be invading in the jungle with the jungler could be ganking the mid laner's lane, the mid laner and the jungler could be going to another lane, the mid laner and the jungler could be warding defensively. There are all sorts of things that these two champions could be doing together. But say you're on a patch like the World's patch, and it was more beneficial to gank a lot than I think it is on this patch, where I think jungle invade strategies matter a lot more. So that could really affect like your jungle proximity. Also, the champion you play will affect a lot the jungle proximity. So previously we had very aggressive, right now we have a lot of very aggressive jungle picks in solo queue and some of them in competitive. But then in the previous split, the World Championship meta, we had almost all tanks, right? Yeah. So that's going to affect like how much the jungler is going to be fighting or in lanes in the early game. So I think that there are a lot of different variables that are constantly changing with any statistic that you're looking at that are going to affect the way that you interpret it. So ultimately it comes down to, like, the big solution is not that statistics are completely worthless, but it's you have to watch the game anyway to interpret the statistic. So you're not going to get a statistic that you can look at, like raw statistical data, and say, pick this player over this player, you know? Yeah, so.
I think jungle proximity is a really good one. I think another really good one to look at in terms of the way variables really balloon, like, so they increase just from like a mathematical standpoint, they increase exponentially in terms of all of the different scenarios you can have. Mm-hmm. And I think another really good one to look at is kill participation, because it's something that I feel like a lot of people take out of context, and they're like, oh, it's really good that this jungler has this kill participation, or it's really great that this mid laner has such a high kill participation, and it's kind of boiled down to high kill participation. High kill participation equals good and low kill participation equals bad, but that's not actually the case. And what's really interesting, I try to do this like once a split, just to take the kill participation of each team and come up with like an average for that team. So from a raw data perspective, what I try to do is see which teams have the highest kill participation across the board among all their players, like as a unit. And then I look at the games themselves and I compare that to see like, oh, is this more of a team fighting team, or are they splitting off and fighting in like 2v1 or 3v2 scenarios where they're doing smaller skirmishes? And that's why I think kill participation is another good case of a statistic that's really good, but you absolutely need to be looking at the game to identify what those numbers mean. And there's no like this number equals good, this number equals bad. It's more like, this is how this team plays, and here's how kill participation can tell you that alongside watching the game.
I remember in kill participation, my favorite example is I remember in 2014 when a lot of people were praising Clearlove because his kill participation was really high. And this was when I felt like Clearlove hadn't really established synergy with his lanes very much at all. And so the team would actually end up behind a lot, and almost no kills would occur in early game or anything like this, but they would team fight like crazy. So if you actually looked at the kill participation statistics of almost every member of the team, they were really high relative to the other teams in the OPL. So it was just that they were constantly grouping as 5 or as a unit, and winning fights that way, and that's how they got such high kill participation, and it wasn't specific to Clearlove in any regard. So people were saying, oh, but his kill participation, nothing happens without Clearlove. Well, nothing happens without Name. Nothing happens without FCZF. Nothing happens without you. I think Corlin was the only one who was kind of like off to the side. But it was
top lane life.
Yeah, so it was an interesting setup and an interesting thing to look at. So I think that's a bunch of stuff that can be misinterpreted. For example, I also think like words per minute is one of the ones that's thrown out so much to be a gauge of how well a team is controlling the map, or how good team vision is, or how good a player vision is. And I think some people look at it and say, well, this person is placing more wards. First of all, it's like really questionable because a lot of people will just go trinket, or they'll go sightstone, and it doesn't really matter. And then a lot of it functions on whether or not that lane gets priority. Like one of the projects that I'm doing on now is I'm looking at some of Bjergsen's actions throughout World Championships, like when he left lane. And the thing is because TSM have often placed so much emphasis on him getting priority in lane, it's really hard to compare his actions directly to his opposing mid laner, because he'll have the opportunity to ward or to do a bunch of other things way more often, just by having like way more push in his lanes and stuff like this. So I think that like all of this stuff in terms of, and he warded a ton. He basically just like Bjergsen's standard go-to is, oh, I have lane priority, I should ward the jungle entrance now. Yay. He's a very exciting mid laner to track, let me tell you. But the reality of the situation is just kind of like, there are so many factors that go into like your ability to place wards. Oftentimes, if you're ahead, you'll have way more opportunities to place wards. It's more like what you're doing with vision, whether or not the vision is good. Like people were looking at SKT and saying that their vision is terrible, but they often would fall behind and they'd place wards defensively, and they would care way more about clearing vision than making sure that they had vision. So it was not like that shocking that they would have way less wards than other Korean teams. So I think it's just people don't necessarily understand. I think it's fair to say that even some of the most qualified to understand and interpret and talk about the game don't really understand how to interpret the statistics we have. Would you say that that's a fair criticism to make?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'd say that about myself. Like, I think that like all of us have a long way to go in terms of using statistics, and that doesn't mean like I think you should throw out all statistics at all. That's definitely not it. But I think we should continue to challenge ourselves to be able to provide statistical analysis in a better context. Like, I would say that about myself. I would say that about you. I would say that about anyone, to be honest.
I'd almost rather not use statistics, because I think you get much more out of talking about examples of player behavior that are, like, isolated and talking about what they mean. So,
I mean, statistics for me, like, so when I write with statistics, I've noticed that, and this is why, like, I don't necessarily try to avoid them, but I try to keep this in mind while writing. When you use statistics, I feel like people tend to latch onto those as, like, a end-all, be-all. And again, so instead of taking the greater context, they instead take it as, like, she is saying X because of Y statistic. And I think that is an incorrect way of looking at things. It's almost like when you're reviewing something and you give it like a letter grade and people only focus on the letter grade and like not what you say. Oh, it tilts me so hard. So anyway, that is like my comparison to how statistics are sometimes interpreted by the community. So I guess it's a challenge to us to provide context and really specific in-game examples. And then it's also a challenge to the community to not get too hung up on focusing on the number and rather take everything in greater context.
I feel like every time you use a statistic, you have to heavily contextualize it. And I see, because of short attention spans and focus on entertainment and stuff like this, so often on the broadcast people will say, well, this jungler has high jungle proximity, so he's a good jungler. And it's just like, I don't know, I don't think you guys actually think that, or maybe you do, but it's really weird because it feels almost like people are shorthanding the education around statistical analysis or just analysis of the game in general, because the main source of information for spectators is supposed to be entertainment based. So in those cases, I actually think the use of statistics is sometimes really damaging to public understanding of how the game works in general. And so I have a lot of issues with that. Also, people talking about gold lead as if it absolutely means a team is ahead. You could be behind like 2k gold and then your champions are terrible late game and you lose. You could be ahead tank 2k gold, But also, like, gold percentage. If people, I think this used to be way more relevant before we had a better understanding in the game of lane assignments, for example, where people would say, oh, our 80 carries behind, let's send him to the bot lane to farm. Whereas that almost never happens now. It often is much more about, okay, their Gnar is pushing against us, which champion do we think can match Gnar in this lane? And that's the champion that will end up being matched against Gnar in that particular lane, and we'll get the gold and the resources for that reason, because that's how they set up the team comp with that particular matchup in mind. So I think that there's just a lot of misunderstanding in terms of gold percentage and just like which players get resources. And if you have a high gold percentage, it doesn't mean that you're selfish. It means that your team tends to play like side laning, top lane comps. So I think it's just really weird that this ends up being a focus in that regard.
And also when people talk resources, what that actually means, because again, like that, there's just so many variables, like vision, control, how the waves are pushing, what champions people have, like it's that even like champion choice means a lot in terms of how you're evaluating gold percentage and whether someone's a quote unquote like selfish player, so to speak. Like there are players that need to be propped up by gold and ganks and stuff like that, but you'll never be able to tell just by looking at raw statistics. You'll have to look at the game itself.
And I think that's my fundamental issue with statistics, is that you can use statistics to, like, the way that I've started using statistics is I make observations based on watching a ton of games, and then I go and I find a statistic, and I'm like, yeah, okay, that's basically what I expected. Here, pad out my article. This is fun. Because my statistics don't really necessarily support or validate my point. They don't necessarily start me on an investigation or anything. I just add them because I feel like I need to, because the community says stuff like, her analysis isn't very good because she doesn't use statistics.
I love using statistics, but I also feel like they need like a ton of context. Like obviously, like if you follow me on Twitter for more than like, so right now I haven't done any recently, but usually about more than a month, I will release just a raw jungle pathing spreadsheet that I do very frequently. And the reason actually isn't statistical analysis. It's just to see what a team is doing early game. That's it. Like it's just to provide me with like a record of remembering what actually happened in this early game and how the pathing of the jungler kind of radiates outward across the map, how everything is interconnected. So again, like I love statistics, but it's to provide, it's to help me with contextualizing what is happening in the game. And I think that's like absolutely necessary.
And again, because of all the variables and everything we brought up, almost no sample size is rigorous. So it's not like I hate statistics, I just feel like in the form that they have right now, they're almost never for anything except adding color. So you can look at a statistic and ask yourself why that is, but sometimes it's not necessarily a meaningful conclusion. Like some of the best statistics, you have to get through observation anyway. Like you can say, oh, okay, in this game, they set up for blue buff at this point. Let's look at another game. Did they set up for blue buff like in this setup in this point? Okay, so then this is a pattern, and we have a ton of stuff. But this is like not a generic statistic. This is like this is a statistic that you have to basically hand gather, and then through the process of hand gathering it, you can write an interpretive article about it where you heavily contextualize all the information that you gained. But it's just like really difficult to get meaningful conclusions based on raw numbers in general. And I don't know. I have a really hard problem with it. I know that there have been advanced statistics that people have published when doing statistical analysis, like Riot Games have tried to make a bunch of more advanced metrics, like the damage rating. But even damage rating is very easily flawed, and some of the easiest flaws of damage rating to point to is that they admit that they don't account for average game time, when that is one of the largest biases in calculating damage numbers or damage percentage or anything like this. And so when they did this cool thing where they're like, oh, Power of Evil has the highest damage rating of mid laners in the LCS, and then I think it was Caps who was second. It was like of the top teams, like top 5 teams or whatever, the playoffs attending teams, the teams with the longest average game time had the top 2 mid laners for damage rating. And no one pointed this out for some fucking godforsaken reason. And so it just became like, oh, Power of Evil is just a god. He has an amazing high damage rating, when you can't disentangle like average game time from statistics like that. So I think it's really difficult to do that, and it's just, I would rather not add to the bullshit that is like statistical analysis, so I oftentimes just avoid it. I don't know.
I mean, I think I'd like to see, so like transitioning, I guess, into what we're going to talk about next a bit, like I like to see people trying to develop more advanced statistics, and I don't think that the pursuit of that is bad whatsoever. I think what is dangerous is when people immediately take that as fact, or like when someone comes out and says, hey, I'm working on this statistic that's slightly more advanced, and here are the calculations behind it, and this is why I'm doing this, and then people take it suddenly as like, oh man, like this is the new end-all be-all statistic that everyone has to take into consideration, whereas I don't think that should be the case. I think everything should be taken as like, we're working on it, because that's the truth. Like, again, like, I hate to keep repeating myself, but the amount of variables in League of Legends is ridiculous. Like, to me, at this point, it's insurmountable. Like, in order to get an objective statistical analysis, like, to your point, you would have to take such a small sample size that it would mean absolutely nothing, because it would have to be on the same champion, the same build, the same matchup, the same game time, the same, like, there's no way right now. And maybe there will be in the future in some sort of crazy calculation that I like can't even fathom in my head. But just the amount of variables that there are that you would have to somehow make the same in order to get an empirical analysis, at that point, your sample size is down to like a game, like a game. Or, I mean, like 3 or 4 games. Like, if you manage to get it down to, say, like 3 or 4 games, right? Even then, that changes within the next month or so, based on patching.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just insane.
I agree that it's fair to say that it's interesting to go into statistics and to look at what kind of statistics and stuff we can develop, but I just feel like the perception of where statistical analysis or statistical development of League of Legends is versus where it actually is really, really bad. And sometimes like actually hurts people's understanding of the game. And I've contributed to that in certain regards and everything else, and I just would rather, so in a lot of ways, I would rather like analysis of games right now be more based on examples that you can see repeatedly of players doing certain behaviors, and then talk about the context in which these players are doing stuff. This ends up being like much more involved, much more difficult to talk about, but that's why I think things like little breakdown videos like Zyrene and Jat were really valuable and really interesting to people. So I think that stuff like that is much more meaningful and much more interesting in an effort to understand the game and the player thought processes and what's good in the game professionally and what makes players strong than stuff like kill percentage or damage per minute or wards placed per minute or wards clears per minute or anything of that nature can be right now. So you can even talk about like, oh, okay, what we see is there's a consistent pattern of this team sends their jungler bottom at 6 minutes. They often get first turret, and then they rotate all the way their bot lane across the map super early. So they're one of the first teams consistently to get all 3 turrets. But this, again, is something that you basically have to track in games. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to talk about getting mid-turret first or anything of that nature, then, again, this is something you're having to track, something that you're having to perceive within the context of the game itself. So if you're not watching the game, statistics are useless. And at that point, just watch the games and just mentally track what you're... I just, like, it feels so frustrating to me, I know, but it's like, people try to make the claim that the act of just watching the games and making observations is not as rigorous as use of statistics, when I don't think we have statistics that can even come close to what you can gain from observing the game at this point in time. Anyway, I think I've sort of beaten a dead horse. Is there anything else, like, on that particular topic you'd want to discuss?
Nope, that's about it. I feel like I keep repeating myself, too, so...
I think, so one of the solutions that people pointed out, and I feel like it's really good to address this, is this idea of machine learning and computer programs that can synthesize information and data to come to patterns faster and make observations faster than like a human mind. And so a lot of this is down to, if you have so many games, like so many repeated games, then you can have the machine account for things like this item build, or you can have the machine learn to make really intelligent decisions. Like, one example of machine learning is I guess, in intelligent cars, or like artificially intelligent cars, where the cars are self-driving and they learn over time based on situations and behaviors that they're put into. So this is a type of machine learning type technology that's in development. I think that there have been people who are applying machine learning to League of Legends, but none of it has really been made public, right? And nothing has really come to the forefront because they're not necessarily making super good headway. And there are a variety of reasons for that, right? One is that, again, these sorts of processes and behaviors rely on a lot of information. And machine learning itself right now is still a technology that's being under development, so we have a lack of information, and when a lot of this technology is unsupervised, they will draw conclusions from patterns that aren't necessarily there. So a famous example that I like to use is when they were having machines look at stock market and stuff like this, and they noticed there was a trend between US GDP, the S&P 500, and US homicide rates. That was effectively meaningless, but it was a pattern that it was observing, and it was like trying to draw conclusions from that. Whereas I think that if you have, so when you're drawing that to League of Legends, you can have machines who are gathering data from solo queue or something, and they notice like meaningless patterns, like when there's a Riven in the top lane, like bottom lane tends to feed more often out of frustration. Because everyone hates Riven, and
very accurate solo queue analysis from the machine.
Try to draw meaningful conclusions from that. And then a lot of decision making based on solo queue, if you're trying to use solo queue information to apply to competitive or anything like this, is going to be inaccurate, because like you almost have to dive into solo queue to get a large enough sample size, but that's not necessarily going to give you useful patterns for competitive play, right? Or useful patterns for high level play at all. So I think it's really interesting that people are looking at this and working on it, but there are good reasons why we haven't seen any like meaningful conclusions or meaningful information published from this kind of investigation. And it's really difficult because it's like using an experimental technology to kind of hack at an experimental field, being like esports statistical analysis.
Yeah.
So I think that people can get excited about that if they want, but it's something that I feel like is still going to be years in development anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's something that I definitely like hope people continue to put effort into, because like I said, the amount of variables in League of Legends is insurmountable to me for a human brain to be able to calculate on their own, because the amount of variables involved is so astronomically high that you would have to have a computer constantly running all of these different scenarios and consistently gathering data. So I hope that people do continue to look into it. I just also hope that as things trickle out, as teams start maybe using some more statistical analysis, that they definitely provide context as to how it's working. And like so I know like a lot of people have brought up Clutch Gaming as an example, but even people associated with their statistical analysis program are just like, we watched a lot of VODs. Like, that's how we did this. Like, that's what it comes down to. And that doesn't mean that statistics are meaningless, but again, it just means you absolutely have to have the context of watching the game go hand in hand with the statistics. And I don't see a point in time soon where that is not the case, just based on the amount of information that you can draw from a single League of Legends game.
And people have been misinformed about how organizations are building teams for a really long time. Like, for some reason, people were under the impression that Immortals had a Moneyball approach. I can 100% guarantee you that they did not have a Moneyball approach, okay? I mean, you can even find public information about this, right? Where I'm not even sure if this was a joke. So I could just be like tilting out of control off of a joke tweet, but it's like, I think Fionn made some tweet about thank you for bringing Flame over and giving him like a chance to shine, and then Noah replied with thank you for inspiring me to bring him over. And I feel like with the kinds of players that Immortals has consistently hired, they have been narrative-driven hires. Like, just in general, like, it feels like this kind of Cody Sun was the hyped-up rookie. If there was going to get a rookie assigned to a team, it was going to be Cody Sun. Flame has been constantly said that he's just, like, in ELO hell. So many people were looking at Ola, and part of the reason that Ola was brought over was for leadership reasons. It turns out he didn't really even understand the game that well and had to be taught, so that wasn't even accomplished. So, like, giving this kind of credit to Immortals is very weird to me, because it wasn't a Moneyball approach, it wasn't anything like that. And Clutch Gaming also doesn't have a Moneyball approach or anything like that. It just, like, it isn't happening, and people keep bringing it up. In team environments, there's always, like, a guy who's like, yeah, but his KDA is bad. Could you please just, like, go back to investment banking? Because you clearly don't understand what you're doing here. Continue.
I think, no, the only thing I was going to piggyback on that is, so another thing that I neglected to talk about as to why it was called Moneyball is, the idea, and this is very important within the context of Immortals, the idea is that you are saving money because you're not having to go for the big name players, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're not having to spend a ton of money to pick up someone's contract because you already know that they're like a well-established name, or they're someone who was scouted very early on during their high school career, and they're in the minor leagues, and you already know, like, this guy's going to be great, and so he's obviously a lot more money. That is why it's called Moneyball, because the idea is that if you don't have a lot of money, you can use this empirical statistical analysis to evaluate what players don't cost you as much, so then you can bring them on board and still have a really good team. And yeah, so that's important in the context of Immortals as well, for obvious reasons.
And I think people look at Clutch and they can see almost like this idea of that this was a Moneyball roster. But I really don't feel like you can even make that argument, because Lyra was hyped up ridiculously as being like the best jungler in the league. I still think Haku is probably a top 2 support. You already have the synergy of the bot lane, like if you bring over Apollo. And then after that, like, Febivin, very clear mid lane choice, I think, in terms of like being regarded by a lot of people based on laning statistics. Again, not taking into account that even when top lane last pick was really popular, H2K consistently would give Febiven last pick. And he was not necessarily the best on the types of champions, and he self-admitted that like he didn't necessarily feel the most confident on champions that weren't going to win his lane, and this was something that he and the team had come to themselves. So you have Febiven, who's very, very highly regarded because of things like minion kills at 15 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. And so you have Febiven, and then like if you look at the top laners that were already signed by the time that Clutch was looking at top laners, Solo was very clearly probably the best American choice left. So I don't necessarily think that you can say that this was a Moneyball roster in any regard. It just feels like this, you can almost track the way that this roster was put together, and I hope that all of this like amazing scouting that they've claimed to have done was applied to their academy team. I haven't really heard what their academy team is yet, but I hope that like all of this thorough scouting research was applied to their academy team, because I don't see it in their main league team in general.
I mean, I like their main league team.
Yeah, sure. I'm not saying it's shit, but
I think it's definitely clear that a lot more than statistics went into evaluating these players. I mean, right off the bat, like you have 3 players who spent a significant amount of time together this past split. So, like, not only just the bot lane synergy, which I think, just as an aside, Apollo and Hakuho are rather underrated just in community perception. Especially Hakuho, but then Lyra as well. Like all 3 of them have played together for a while too, which is also very important. To piggyback on that though, another thing that is going to make, and this is kind of out of left field, but I think people should consider it when they're looking at statistics for the upcoming splits in Europe and North America, is that because they're going back to best of ones, there are even fewer games from which to draw statistics. And that's actually really important when you're comparing even statistics that we've kind of said you need context. Like even when you're comparing statistics of a player from last year or this past split to this coming split, it's going to be a lot different because there are a lot fewer games. And that's another really important thing in statistical analysis is your actual sample size.
I also think the approach to a lot of games might be different because you know that you have to win this one game, right? In many situations to remain high in the standings. So I think it will be a different even approach to setting up how teams are going. And so you'll have to contextualize some of the statistics that you get off of this one game even more. Anyway, so this is... So I've complained a lot, right? But what do I think is the best solution? I think if you are going to do stuff with statistics, you do almost have to like make that a single thing that you're doing and contextualize everything that you're writing about. I think if you do observational analysis and you break down something that's happening in a game, that's still valuable, so you should probably stop shitting on people who do that. Not just me, obviously. You can shit on me as much as you want. I'm fine. But finally, also, like, you can support these efforts to build statistics, but don't immediately, if people share, like, preliminary findings or whatever, don't take that as an end-all, be-all to everything that's happening, or to say that the statistic is automatically really good. I also, like, even just talking about some of the metrics that Clutch Gaming have said that they've used, like, the only metric that they said that they've used in scouting players so far was how supports are using lane priority, like either if they're roaming to go ward somewhere or whatever else. I think that that's a terrible statistics to scout a player on. This is just like a random editorial side, but I think that's a terrible metric to scout a player on because you're scouting them on something you can teach them. I think it's much better to like look at situational instances where supports are gaining priority, because if you're seeing them like gain lane priority where they shouldn't, or they're able to consistently gain lane priority when they should, then this is the kind of player I want, because I feel like I can tell that player what to do once he's gained priority with his wards, and it's much harder to teach him to like be good at laning. than it is to figure out what to do after the fact. So I just, for me, like this, I feel like people are misapplying statistics or misapplying observations in general in a lot of regard, in terms of, like, especially if you're scouting young players, like players that you know that you have to develop. This seems like a bad thing to scout a player on. Maybe if it's for your main team, or maybe if it's for like a pinch hitter where you're halfway through the season and you need someone now who already knows a lot of information. But if you're scouting for your academy team or scouting for the future, then I feel like this is a terrible, terrible statistic to scout a player on. Like, what we're scouting on also needs to be examined, and not just like take statistics or take any information, even observational information, like that at face value. So, yeah.
Not just that, but like, just speaking as someone who has been to scouting grounds 2 years in a row now, there's so much that you can teach. So like, I'm talking specifically about scouting players like off the ladder, right? Mm-hmm. There are obviously few exceptions where you can look at players and you can be like, yes, this player who is on the ladder right now is going to be very good in the future. But in terms of looking at players immediately off the ladder who haven't played professionally, you can teach them so much. Like 2 years in a row, I've seen 2 teams with players that, and maybe it's just because I don't pay attention as much to the NA solo queue ladder. I actually don't always pay attention to most ladders until players start to trickle up, because I think, to reiterate this point, I think it's really hard to look at someone in solo queue and be like, they're definitely going to be a good or bad player. But watching like 2 different groups of people teach 2 other different groups of people how to play as a team in even like a very short time frame, it is amazing what a player can learn in that amount of time. And it's actually really impressive. And since League of Legends, as it has grown as a game, has become, the player positions have become way more interconnected as a unit of 5 rather than 5 individuals. I think this also makes it really hard to apply raw statistics to players coming off of solo queue. And I think you will actually, if people try to do that now, where we're at right now, I think you'll end up slighting a lot of players that really could be given a chance and could turn out to be really amazing players because of other things that you can't necessarily see from an empirical solo queue analysis. So yeah, that's always my thing, I guess, with statistics right now in League of Legends. I'm a huge, in case you couldn't tell from this entire conversation, I am a huge statistics fan, actually. I've been a baseball fan since I was like a little kid, and I had like my box score, and I was at Fenway like marking it as players, went around the bases and stuff, and I thought it was super cool. And I honestly love statistics. I love doing jungle pathing spreadsheets. I know everyone thinks I'm insane because that's something you give to like your like analyst grunt because you don't want to do it. You're like, oh, just chart this jungle pathing. But I love it. I think it says a lot about the game. I think you can tell a lot in terms of pattern recognition, but that all requires context. And that's my big thing, is when people look at statistics, like, I beg of you, if I am using a statistic in an article, look at the context in which I am using it, and then if you still disagree, like, definitely call me out on it. Like, I'm more than happy to talk about the way that statistics are used in League of Legends. I just think they always require an eye test. They always require context from watching the actual game.
See, it's exactly because I love statistics, Emily, that I hate League of Legends statistics. So, on that note, thanks everyone for watching, and I hope you gained something from this other than just me shouting into the void.